So it's not Monday's lesson. It's Tuesday's lesson. So welcome to another movement meditations. This week I wanted to cover a subject that I think is incredibly important, but I think it needs a bit of description to understand why it's important to movement practices and to um, yeah to the improvement process. So if we consider that we do some of these lessons to in some way improve our condition, improve our situation, then actually the role of imagination can be incredibly important. Um, the What I want to avoid is it becoming a little too what's the word, too out there. So imagination for me, and for the description I'm going to give for it this week, is very connected with our planning and executive functions, our ability to plan, and the executive functions that are associated with the developed prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is something that develops as we come out of our initial stage of youth, and our ability to differentiate and to in some way inhibit certain things is very much related to the prefrontal cortex. One of the other things that's completely related to the prefrontal cortex is planning. Um, so if we think back into our evolutionary past, um, planning was something that we had to do in order to get food. We had to watch the movement of the seasons in terms of which foods were available at certain times. We had to plan. We had to consider the future, and also in terms of tracking animal movement. So, for example, an experienced hunter would know that this animal would move in this direction and would be able to kind of forward plan his route in order to intercept that animal. So this is something that we've been involved in as human beings for a really long time, and the role of imagination or planning is something that is completely fundamental to us. So I was thinking I could actually call this lesson, an alternative title would just be thinking and feeling. So sometimes before we do something, we need to think about it. And it's really as simple as that. So imagination really, I would very much simplify it and say that it's just thinking about something before you act. And this kind of ties in with the activation of the prefrontal cortex, but also the ability to inhibit behaviors we don't want to enact. And this is something that we're going to kind of look at with the breathing today. So the breathing is a really good example because all of us have habits with our breathing that we don't necessarily want. So, for example, we might hold our breath in certain situations, or we might have a certain tightness or stiffness in the chest to do with different impacts we've had in our life, physically or psychologically. So as we go through the process we're going to go through today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to compare what we are imagining with what's actually happening in our body. And through that act of comparison, we can actually begin to make step-by-step improvements in our behavior. So this is really something that the role of planning is to improve behavior. So that's a lot of talking to begin with. If you find a comfortable position for you to sit in, it's not important for you to be sitting forward on your chair today, on your sitting bones. If you want to, if that's the most comfortable position for you, you're very welcome to sit like that. If you want to sit back in your chair, even if you want to lie down, whatever is comfortable for you, I would recommend you do that. I'll give you a moment to organize yourself. And now, as you sit there, just initially bring your attention to your breathing. And this is maybe the first time you've done this morning. If you have a habit of bringing your attention to your breathing, then maybe there's some process that you go through in the morning or part of your day where you check in with your breath. But just notice how you're breathing. What's the speed of the breath? What's the tempo? Is it noiseless? Is it quiet breathing? Is it slightly activated? Is it slightly louder? And where do you notice the movement of breath in your body? So the breath is an interesting subject to pick for imagination because there's some really kind of blurred lines between how we pay attention to our breath and how much that either influences or restricts or limits the actual ability of the natural breath. So, what I want you to do initially is just see if you can watch your breath without doing anything, without making any specific effort, without knowing what good breathing is, just to really like be in a place of observation, to watch what's happening with your breath without any judgment, without any sense of right or wrong, and just scan over your body and notice where you feel that movement of breathing, uncontrolled breathing. Good. And then let that go. And then I'd like you to have a picture in your mind of what breathing is. So, one example of that could be a movement in the rib cage. Um, so, as you breathe, there's a sense of expansion in the rib cage. And what I'd like you to do is, I'd like you just to imagine or have some idea of what this movement of the rib cage looks like. Okay, so you're kind of visualizing this movement of the rib cage. You're imagining what your ribs would look like if they were moving with the breath. So just try that. Don't worry about your actual breathing. Just imagine a few times how your ribs would be moving as you breathe. So some examples could be there would be an outwards expansion, a forwards expansion, maybe a backwards expansion, maybe even a 360-degree expansion. So see what's possible for you to imagine. And then when you're ready, let go of the imagination, come back to your attention being on your breath, and notice, bring your mind, bring your attention to your ribs as you breathe. And feel as you watch your ribs as they move, does it correlate? Is there some correlation between your imagined movement, your imagined sense of breathing, and the actual movement of breath? Or are they wildly different? So it could be that we have this kind of imagination of a very healthy 360-degree breathing, but we've had an injury on the left side of our body and we don't mobilize our left ribs at all. So the movement of the ribs actually in reality is very different to this kind of imagined perfect breathing. So just try that a few times. Just see now as you breathe, this is the action part of it. Okay. And you're not trying to impose anything, you're not trying to make your breathing better. But how does it compare? What's the comparison between your imagined sense of what breath is and what it actually is? Good. So then let that go. And now, with your imagination, begin to imagine how the shoulders move in relation to the chest, to the ribs as you breathe. So imagine what the shoulders are doing as the ribs are expanding and contracting beneath them. What movement do the shoulders make? And see if you can imagine it. Imagine yourself in breathing and imagine what movement your shoulders are making or would be making. So some examples could be they could be just staying completely still. That's something you could imagine. They could be moving slightly upwards or slightly outwards. Good. And once you've imagined it a few times, then bring your attention to your breathing again. And notice what the actual movement your shoulders are making. And does it correlate to your imagined action? Or are they different? Take your time. There's no need to rush. What you're doing is you're playing with this sort of sense of planned action or imagined action and actual action. And through this kind of very gentle comparison between these two things, what you can actually come to is one, a more realistic sense of your own movement patterns or your own ability to act, and two, a more fine, um, a more fine or specific ability to imagine your own potential. So if the image that you have doesn't correlate very closely to your actual ability, it's going to be difficult for you to really enact to the best of your own ability, because there's going to be a discrepancy between what you think you're capable of and what you're capable of. So the closer we can make these two things, the closer we can get our imagination to what or how we act, the better that relationship becomes. Good. Take a little rest. Okay, so the next thing I'd like you to do is imagine the flow of air coming down through your nose and into your lungs. And this is very much on the imagination scale of the process. It's an image. You can imagine air coming down through your nose and into your lungs. Oxygen is a substance, so it does move down through us. And before you begin to actually observe what you're doing, just see kind of like, as you imagine it, how full, how rich is the process? Can you imagine the air coming down through both nostrils? Can you imagine it coming through your nasal cavity, down through the back of your throat, right down the windpipe as it splits off into the two lungs, opens out into the various channels in the lungs like tree branches? So the imagination can go very deep, can go really into this. Yeah, I don't know the way to describe it. It's like you don't know that that's happening, but you can imagine it. Good. And then let go of the imagination, and then just notice as you then bring your attention to your breathing and that first part of the breathing and how the air actually feels as it comes down through your nose. So coming away from the thinking aspect and moving more into the feeling aspect. So as you continue to bring your attention to the feeling of the air coming into the nose, and notice how far you can actually track that feeling down in yourself. And maybe the mechanism for feeling it changes as you go through the process of breathing. So for example, at the beginning, maybe the mechanism for feeling the breath would be the inside walls of the nose. There's little hairs or the tissue on the inside wall of the nose. You can actually feel the air coming back into the nose. At a certain point in the process, maybe it turns into more of a movement sense of the breath. So as it comes down into the chest, you start to feel the breath from the kind of from your movement. That's where you get the information that you're breathing from. And how closely does this kind of felt sense correlate to your thought sense? You know, what you imagined you, how you imagined you would be breathing. Is there a difference in speed between the two things? Is there some effort that you make in your breathing process and your kind of actual breathing process that isn't there in your imagination of it? And that maybe shows you that there's a contrast in effort. You know, so actually as you bring yourself into action, maybe you're enacting more effort in the breathing process than you are capable of enacting. Not sure that's the best way to say that. So this process of comparison between the two really is a way of actually beginning to inhibit some of our behavior. So, for example, if I realize that I'm doing something that I don't need to be doing, that gives me an opportunity to stop it. And this is really the function of the prefrontal cortex. So as we activate this kind of planning or kind of cognitive ability of comparison, then we get access to actually, I could not do that behavior. Good. Okay. So there's one last one. I'd like you to imagine what you would do with your abdomen as you breathe in and breathe out. So I'll give you some examples. There are various breathing techniques related to the movement of the abdomen. You could bring the belly in, you could push the belly out, you could not move the belly, you can move the belly a lot. You could move it outwards, you could move it backwards, you could move it forwards, you could move it downwards. There's so many options, but as you imagine yourself, your own abdomen, as you were to breathe, as you imagine it, what's available to you in your imagination? Which of those options is available to you in your imagination? And just imagine your abdomen moving as you breathe in and breathe out. Again, this is one of those places in the body that we perhaps inhibit and that doesn't have a free expression of itself as we breathe. So that could impact our ability to imagine what's possible for the abdomen. Whichever option you've chosen, could you imagine something else? Are there other options you could imagine? So if you imagined your abdomen coming out, could you imagine your abdomen coming in as you breathe in? Could you imagine what it would feel like to hold your abdomen, to hold it still and to not move it as you breathe? And lastly, can you imagine some sense of the abdomen expanding downwards and upwards? Is it possible for you to imagine that? Okay, let go of the imagination and without controlling what you're doing with your breath, so kind of step back with your kind of cognitive abilities, put them in the back seat for a moment, and just observe as you breathe in and breathe out very naturally. What does your abdomen do? And is there any correspondence between what the abdomen is actually doing and any of the variations you imagined before you started? Good. And however the abdomen is now moving, see if you can kind of let go of the breathing again and just get your imagination slightly closer to reality. So see if you can imagine closer to what your body was actually doing. So stop paying attention to the breathing for a moment and just imagine exactly, almost exactly, what your body was actually doing, what you noticed your body was doing. See if you can bring the imagination back or closer to the actual reality of your movement. Good. And then begin to pay attention to the actual movement of your breathing again. Of course, the breath is going to be happening the whole time, but it's a way of kind of moving your attention around what you're paying attention to, more of the kind of psychological process or more of the felt process. Good. So, in this way of kind of bringing the imagination closer to the actual movement and then moving again, So then you can then compare, you can contrast. Is the breath, is your feeling of the breath, is um, your sense of how you move, can you clarify it? Can you become even better at imagining it? So by noticing more what you do as you breathe now normally, can you then take that back into the imagination process and have a better sense of what you actually do? It's like building definition of the picture, like building detail. So each time you go back between imagining it a few times, watching the breath, feeling the breath a few times, you're kind of going through this process of getting closer and closer to reality, but also building your awareness of the process. You're kind of growing your awareness of the process of breathing as you do this. Another way of describing this would be becoming more skillful. It's like the more you know yourself, the more detail you have about the way you do something, the better you can become at it. Great. So let go of all of that. Let go of all of that. And then just feel your breathing again, very naturally. Don't control it at all. Find a comfortable position for you to sit in. And scan over the parts of your body or the areas that we've kind of covered so far in the breathing. So, for example, the movement of the ribs, the movement of the shoulders in relation to the ribs, the movement of air as it comes down through the nose and into the chest, and lastly, the movement of the abdomen. And just kind of spread your attention over all of it, and see if you can kind of feel the whole of that process. And like, can you track all of those different elements at the same time? So this is like complex planning or complex observation. And is there a difference in your sense of the breathing, sense of your own, like kind of clarity of your own, how you breathe? Do you have a better sense of how you breathe now at the end of the lesson than at the beginning of the lesson? And we haven't really done any movements to improve anything. We haven't kind of altered the breath in any way. Really, what we've done is we've just played with this kind of seesaw between imagination and action. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I think it's a fascinating subject, and I think that it's at the heart of the Feldenkrais method, and really at the heart of improvement in general. So yeah, if you have any comments or you want to say anything, please do in the comment thread. I will be teaching again tomorrow. I haven't imagined the lesson yet, but I will be doing that later on today. And there's going to be 3 this week, so it's going to be tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday, and that will wrap up the 50 of these lessons. And then we'll see what happens after that. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd love to hear from you. If you want to watch any of the previous lessons, they're all in my Facebook group. You can also access them on YouTube if you prefer YouTube to Facebook. And yes, there's a link to my PayPal account if you want to make a small contribution for the lessons. And thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Okay, I will see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.